Let them watch. Fill my cup again.
How many lovers can one person take in a single night? It's a question of stamina, a question of desire. For most people, it's a matter of private fantasy or public morality. But for one Rumong empress, it was a public competition. For her, the answer wasn't a secret. It was a trophy. This is the story of Valeria Messalina, a woman who, as a teenager, married the stuttering, limping, and long overlooked Claudius, only to see him unexpectedly become the most powerful man on earth. In an instant, she was the Empress of Rome, the Augusta, a figure meant to be a symbol of virtue, motherhood, and divine grace. But Messalina was not virtuous, and her grace was a mask. Behind the palace walls, she possessed an appetite so notoriously insatiable that it sent shockwaves through the Roman elite. An appetite not just for the pleasures of the flesh, but for wealth, for power, and for blood. This is not just a story about a promiscuous empress. This is the story of how one woman's bottomless lust held an entire empire captive. It is the story of how she weaponized her body to build a reign of terror, and how that same insatiable hunger led to one of the most sensational, bizarre, and brutal downfalls in all of Roman history. To understand Messalina, you must first understand the legends. The stories of her decadence were not whispered rumors. They were recorded as fact by astonished Roman historians. Her private life was not a secret. It was a performance of almost unbelievable audacity. The most famous of these stories comes to us from the historian Pliny the Elder. He recounts a challenge, a contest of carnal endurance between the empress and Rome's most famous, most skilled, and most experienced prostitute. The rules were simple. The two women would compete for 24 hours to see who could take the most lovers. The setting was a private chamber, the participants a steady stream of hand-picked men. The stakes? Imperial pride versus professional reputation. The historian writes that the prostitute, a woman named Scylla, was a champion in her field. But she was no match for the empress. As the night wore on and the sun rose, Scylla, exhausted, physically broken, finally gave up. But Messalina did not. Pliny the Elder records that she continued relentless, finally reaching a score of 25 men. And even then, he writes with a tone of shocked disbelief, she was weary, but not yet satisfied. She had proven her point. She was, in all things, supreme. But this contest, as shocking as it is, was not an isolated event. It was, perhaps, not even the most scandalous of her exploits. The poet Juvenal, in his Satires, paints an even grimmer, more disturbing portrait of the empress's double life. This wasn't a private competition. This was a knightly profession. Juvenal claims that Messalina, the most powerful woman in the world, could not be satisfied by the palace. Every night, when her husband, the Emperor Claudius, was asleep, she would disguise herself. She would put on a simple tunic and a common cheap wig and slip out of the palace, her face hidden by a hood. Her destination was the Suburra, the sleaziest, most dangerous red light district in Rome. She would walk into one of the lowest, filthiest brothels, a place where senators and slaves alike came to satisfy their basest urges. There, she would rent a small, bare, smoky cubicle. She would take her place in the lineup of common prostitutes under a false name, Lysiska, the she-wolf. Juvenal writes, with unconcealed disgust, that she would stand naked with gilded nipples and receive all comers, demanding her fee. She would work all night, taking man after man, driven not by a need for money, but by what Juvenal describes as a burning, unfulfilled lust. When the brothel owner dismissed the girls at dawn, Messalina would be the last to leave. She would walk back to the imperial palace, exhausted by men, but not yet satisfied, bringing the stench of the brothel back to the emperor's sacred bed. Think of the sheer, breathtaking audacity, the risk, the transgression. In Rome, Prostitutes were infamous ones. They had no legal rights. They were the lowest rung of society. For the Empress, the Augusta, the divine mother of the nation, to secretly be one was not just a moral failing. It was a religious and political time bomb. It was a complete inversion of the Roman order. And she did it, night after night, for fun. But to dismiss Messalina as a simple, mindless nymphomaniac is to completely misunderstand her. It is to fall for the very caricature her enemies wanted us to see. Her insatiable hunger was real, but her mind was sharp, calculating, and cold. Her sexuality was not just a private vice. It was her single most effective political weapon. You see, her husband, the Emperor Claudius, was an intelligent man, but he was paranoid, easily manipulated, and deeply insecure. The true power in the empire was held by a shadowy cabal of his most trusted advisors, his freedmen, former slaves named Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus. These men ran the empire, and Messalina, in her early 20s, ruled them all. She understood power. She knew that in Claudius's court, loyalty was a commodity, and her body was the most valuable currency. She used her bed to build alliances, to guarantee her power, and to utterly annihilate her enemies. Her method was brutally, terrifyingly simple. She would target a powerful, influential nobleman. She would demand that he become her lover. This was a lethal test. If the man accepted, he was now in her debt. He was a co-conspirator. He could never betray her, because to reveal her adultery would be to reveal his own. He was trapped, an unwilling tool in her schemes. But if he refused, he was a dead man. Take the case of Appius Silenus. He was a powerful, respected statesman, a man of old-fashioned morals. Messalina desired him. She propositioned him relentlessly, and he, foolishly, virtuously, refused her. Again and again, Messalina was enraged. An insult to her desire was an insult to her power. She couldn't just accuse him of rejecting her. That would expose her. So she and her chief ally, the freedman Narcissus, devised one of the most diabolical and shady plots in Roman history. Early one morning, Narcissus burst into the emperor's chambers, his face a mask of fake terror. He claimed he had just had a horrible nightmare. In his dream, he saw Appius Silenus, dagger in hand, assassinating Claudius. Moments later, Messalina ran in claiming, with feigned panic, that she had just had the exact same dream. The paranoid Claudius, terrified by this divine warning, didn't even wait to hold a trial. He didn't ask a single question. He immediately ordered Silenus's execution. The man was dead before lunch. He refused her bed, so she sent him to his grave. Her appetites were not just sexual. They were material. And when she wanted something, she got it. There was a magnificent estate in Rome, the gardens of Lucullus, which she coveted. But they were owned by another powerful man, Valerius Asiaticus. Asiaticus was no fool. He was a former consul and immensely wealthy. But Messalina wanted his gardens. She couldn't seduce him, so she destroyed him. She had her allies fabricate a list of trumped-up charges: insubordination, adultery, even failing to maintain discipline among his soldiers. The charges were a sham. Asiaticus was put on trial before the emperor. He gave a powerful, moving defense that left Claudius stunned and on the verge of acquitting him. Messalina, standing by, saw the trial slipping from her grasp. She knew she had to act. She quietly left the room. But according to the historian Tacitus, she had an agent standing by. As she passed him, she whispered one cold, chilling word. A word that Tacitus says even her agent misheard. The agent, thinking she had said the Latin word for leave, faked a coughing fit and walked out. But that is not what she said. She had whispered the name of her chief executioner. Outside the courtroom, her agent, realizing his mistake, didn't wait. He went to the guard commander and gave the order anyway. Valerius Asiaticus was found guilty. He was allowed to take his own life to avoid public execution. He died, and before his body was cold, Messalina took possession of his gardens. The price of her new real estate was the blood of a good man. For years, Messalina's reign of lust, greed, and terror was absolute. She sold citizenships, she sold political offices, she took bribes, and she eliminated anyone who stood in her way. She was the empress, and she was untouchable. But an appetite that is never satisfied will eventually devour itself. Messalina's final act was one of such breathtaking, insane arrogance that it shattered the very reality of the Roman state. It was a move so hot and so brazen, it finally, fatally, crossed the line from private vice to public treason. Her target was a man named Gaius Silius, the senator, the consul-elect, and according to the sources, the most handsome man in Rome. This was not a one-night stand in a brothel. This was not a forced affair with a terrified politician. This was a full-blown, passionate, all-consuming obsession. Messalina fell madly in love, and she was no longer discreet. She showered Silius with gifts, with honors, with treasures stolen from the imperial palace. She forced him to divorce his own noble wife. She would visit his house openly, accompanied by her entire entourage. The Roman elite watched, paralyzed, as the empress conducted a public affair, daring anyone to stop her. Then, in the year 48 AD, she did the unthinkable. While her husband, the Emperor Claudius, was away from Rome, officiating a ceremony in the port city of Ostia, Messalina and Gaius Silius celebrated a full public wedding. She signed the marriage contract. She made the sacrifices to the gods. She, the Empress of Rome, committed bigamy. Historians are still, to this day, completely baffled by this act. What was she thinking? Was it a drunken, theatrical farce? A bizarre, mystical ritual? Or was it exactly what it looked like? A blatant public coup d'etat? A declaration that Claudius was finished, and that Silius, her handsome lover, was the new emperor of Rome? For a few days, the city held its breath. Nothing happened. But in the shadows, the conspiracy that had protected Messalina for so long finally broke. Her freedmen allies Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus were terrified. They knew that if Silius became emperor, his first act would be to execute them and clean house. Messalina, in her arrogance, had finally made a lethal enemy. Narcissus, the most ruthless of them all, took a desperate gamble. He rode to Ostia at top speed. He burst in on the confused, aging emperor. He didn't mince words. "Do you know you are divorced?" he screamed. "Do you know you are no longer emperor? The people of Rome, the army, the Senate, they have all seen your wife married to another man." Claudius, as always, was paralyzed by panic and indecision. Narcissus saw his chance. He didn't wait for an order. He seized control. He strode to the Praetorian Guard commanders and declared a state of emergency on the emperor's behalf. He wrote the execution warrants for Messalina and Silius himself and sealed them with the emperor's stolen ring. The party was over. Word reached Messalina that the guards were coming. Her guests fled, scattering into the streets. Her new husband, Silius, ran to the public forum to try and plead his case. He was cut down on the spot. Messalina, abandoned, her power evaporating in an instant, fled in a panic. And in a moment of dark, poetic justice, she ran to the one place she thought she was safe, the gardens of Lucullus. The very gardens she had murdered Valerius Asiaticus to possess. She was cornered, pathetic, a desperate woman in a beautiful garden, her imperial robes stained with dirt. The historian Tacitus describes her final grim moments. As she cowered there, one person came to her side, her mother, a woman Messalina had scorned and ignored during her years of power. Her mother knew there was no hope. She told her daughter that her life was over, and that the only honorable path left was suicide. She handed Messalina a dagger. But Messalina, the woman who had so calmly, so coldly, sent dozens of men and women to their deaths, was, in the end, a coward. She trembled. She wept. She put the blade to her breast, but she couldn't push it in. The garden gates burst open. A centurion and his soldiers, dispatched by Narcissus, marched in. The centurion saw the pathetic, weeping empress, her hand trembling on the dagger. He wasted no time. He drew his own sword, and with one brutal, efficient, unceremonious thrust, he ran her through. She died there, in the dirt, in the garden she had stolen, bleeding out at her mother's feet. When the Emperor Claudius was told, later that night at dinner, that his wife was dead, his only recorded reaction was to nonchalantly ask for another cup of wine. The Roman Senate, eager to appease their terrified emperor and distance themselves from the scandal, immediately issued a damnatio memori, a damnation of her memory. Her name was chiseled off public monuments. Her face was scraped from statues. It was an official order to erase her from history, to pretend she had never existed. But you cannot erase a story like this. The very attempt to destroy her memory is what made her immortal. The very historians who recorded her fall Tacitus, Suetonius, Juvenal were all men, writing decades later in an empire that was deeply distrustful of powerful women. And so we are left with a final, haunting, shady question. Was Valeria Messalina truly the insatiable, sexually driven monster the records claimed she was? A depraved creature who held orgies, competed with prostitutes, and worked in brothels? Or was she something even more dangerous? Was she a brilliant, ambitious, and utterly ruthless politician? A woman who played the brutal game of Roman power better than any man? And was her monstrous sexuality simply the only language her male enemies could use to describe a womanist power that terrified them so completely? The truth, like Messalina herself, is buried in the dark, manipulative, and scandalous soil of Roman history. Her name was meant to be forgotten. Instead, it became a byword for female corruption, a hot topic for 2,000 years, and a grim, immortal warning about the lethal combination of sex, power, and blood.